Turmoil in Thailand. China and Vietnam continue to spar. And is Japan's collective defense really worth it? I'm Steve Miller. These stories and more are on the May 30th edition of Asian News Weekly. Welcome to the show, everyone. To start things off this week, we'll begin with a few updates from Thailand. Throughout the past week, stories developed at quite the feverish pace, and Asian News Weekly shared many of them through our Twitter feed. In today's episode, we'll present you some of the major developments since our last podcast, as well as the Asia Now special report. First, the international community continued to voice its objections to the actions of General Prayut. United States Secretary of State John Kerry called for the early elections that reflect the will of the people, and that there was no justification for the coup. Quote, "This act will have negative implications for U.S.-Thai relationship, especially for our relationship with the Thai military. We are reviewing our military and other assistance engagements consistent with U.S. law." United Nations Secretary Ban Ki-moon said he was seriously concerned, and the UN Human Rights Watch weighed in on the issue, issuing the following statement. Quote, "We remind the authority of Thailand's obligations under the international human rights law, in particular the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which strictly limit the application of emergency powers." End quote. Over the weekend, General Prayut was able to communicate with Thailand's revered king and secure his blessing, confirming his status as the legitimate governing figure in Thailand. That same weekend, he dissolved the Senate, making the newly formed National Council for Peace and Order the only legislative body. Immediately following the press conference announcing the king's support, it was shared that former Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra and Yellow Shirt leader Suthep Thaugsuban had been released. It was unclear how many other of the politicians and figures told to report to army bases were still being held at this time. While General Prayut was solidifying his position, those opposing the coup began coming forward. What resulted was a steady stream of images flowing through Twitter and Instagram over the weekend. While rules under martial law called for all groups larger than 5 to be disbanded, some 300 gathered in Bangkok on May 24th. In another protest march, participants assembled at the Victory Monument and numbered close to 1,000, shouting, "Soldiers, get out!" and "No coup." When soldiers tried to block further protests, those marching made use of the BTS SkyTrain to circumnavigate obstacles. Minor scuffles did occur, but nothing on a large or violent scale, which certainly was a possibility. One of the more disturbing events this past week has been the assault on free speech and the ability to report news easily within Thailand. Once the military seized control, it was virtually impossible to view news stories inside Thailand. Twitter and other social media outlets became the go-to sources on what was taking place. In fact, the only way to get the whole picture was to strap oneself into the internet and watch things play out like some sort of television drama. Under martial law, the army has the power to detain anyone for 7 days without charge or warrant. To extend that detention, charges must be filed in court. It was this provision that led the army to detain journalists Pravit Rojanapruk and Thanapol Isakul. Reporters Without Borders condemned that action, saying, quote, "The military government, which claims it wants to restore peace and the public order, cannot continue to trample freedom of information underfoot." End quote. By midweek, most of the networks had returned. With the junta firmly in control, Prayut is now poised to begin implementing the much-requested reforms prior to the coup. In the interim, the junta will appoint economists and various officials to restore the economy, which has slowed, and has also vowed to see to it that rice farmers are paid their dues. Prayut has said he hopes to have the new government in place so he can return to his sole military duties. However, with the continuing developments in Thailand, it's unclear when or if that day will come anytime soon. Despite all this, it's important to remember that these events are taking place largely in a few areas inside Bangkok. Those I have spoken to via Skype and online still report the majority of the country isn't being affected. And as of this podcast recording, the curfew has already been relaxed. Be sure to follow @Asian News Weekly on Twitter for more updates throughout the week. In just a few minutes, updates on the Koreas exchanging fire in the Yellow Sea. China isn't backing down from its position that it owns the China Sea, recently intentionally ramming and sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat near an oil rig it placed in the highly contested waters. All 10 sailors from the Vietnamese vessel were recovered without injuries. China paints a different story, saying the Vietnamese vessel simply capsized after harassing a Chinese ship and accidentally colliding with it. Quote, "We are now fighting by peaceful means, by propagandizing against China's illegal invasion. In addition, we try to avoid any intentional clashes with Chinese vessels to minimize damages and casualties on our end," said Ha Li, deputy head of the Vietnam Fisheries Surveillance Department. China has also reportedly sent in additional fishing vessels to detract Vietnamese patrols from carrying out their duties. Analysts familiar with the confrontation speculate that if things continue at their present pace, Vietnam may not have enough vessels in their fleet to further deter China. Scott Bentley has noted that in other conflicts, Chinese vessels are using their water cannons to target communication arrays on Vietnamese ships. He says China is doing this to hamper effective transmission of information. Vietnam continues to call on China to engage in discussions, which China has marginally accepted. Furthermore, Vietnam has kept the majority of its warships in port and away from the Chinese fleet. Vietnam continues to reach out to the international community, which has largely condemned China's move into the sea, and Vietnam may look to partner with regional states or the United States to shore up its defenses, as they are too weak to go it alone. Which brings me to the heart of the issue. The situation in Vietnam shows the lengths to which China is willing to go to assert its control over the China Sea. ASEAN partners, Japan, and the United States need to decide what their next move will be, and act soon. The continued wait-and-see approach, while effective in avoiding armed conflict, does nothing to dissuade China from strengthening its position, and quite possibly delay action to a point where nothing can be done. With China continuing to use non-lethal but physical force against Vietnam, is it time for ASEAN partners to respond in kind alone or with the aid of Japan and the United States? Please share your thoughts on this highly contested issue. You can visit AsianNewsWeekly.net for links to the stories mentioned in this week's podcast, and also find a minute-by-minute rundown of when each story appears in the show. While you're there, you can leave your thoughts in the comment section, or do it via Facebook or Twitter. Those feeds are also populated throughout the week with additional stories. Just go to facebook.com/AsiaNewsWeekly or follow @AsiaNewsWeekly on Twitter. Last week, 3 North Korean vessels strayed south of the northern limit line. That's the de facto maritime border between the Republic of Korea and the DPRK. They were quickly intercepted by South Korean patrols, which fired several warning shots at the North Korean ships, which then retreated back into their territory. The regional North Korean command issued a statement that it would target South Korean vessels, and soon carried out that threat. Quote, "Around 6 p.m., 2 shells fell near our boat 14 kilometers southwest of Yongpyeong Island," an official from the Joint Chiefs of Staff said. The official then added, "The military is closely watching the north and preparing against additional provocations." However, North Korea said it didn't fire any shells toward the South Korean vessel. It insists South Korea made the provocative move first. According to the Korea Central News Agency, the southwestern front of the Korean People's Army claimed that South Korea had spread false stories peppered with lies and hypocrisy in a bid to mislead public opinion. The report further claims that the rock vessel transgressed past the northern limit line searching for illegal Chinese fishing boats. South Korea sent, quote, "a stern warning against the shelling provocation, and to make it clear that the North bears all responsibility," according to Seoul's defense ministry. South Korean President Park Geun-hye expressed strong regret over the incident, while Defense Ministry spokesman Kim Min-suk called North Korea's recollection of events a blatant lie. The North's main newspaper, the Rodong Sinmun, said, "Nothing will be resolved in inter-Korean relations as long as Park remains in power." While the origins of North Korea's shelling are not precisely known, South Korean Navy officials do not believe their ships were directly targeted. 2010 and 2011 saw fatal conflicts with North Korea in the region, making the area a sensitive subject for many. Yongpyeong Island was shelled and 4 people died, and later North Korea sank the Cheonan, which claimed the lives of 46 sailors. Quote, "The current situation on the Korean peninsula is highly sensitive," said China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Hong Lee. "We hope the relevant parties to keep calm exercise restraint, and refrain from taking actions that may lead to military conflict. The notion of shells being fired back and forth between ROK and DPRK vessels can seem alarming to those not familiar to the chess game currently being played by both sides. The sad situation is, in reality, these exchanges are normal and nothing really to be concerned about. They periodically occur and is North Korea's attempt to see how far it can needle South Korea, possibly hoping for an overreaction where they will then attempt to play the victim card. Some others might even go as far to say that with the Thai coup being so heavily discussed in the news, North Korea is out of the headlines again, and this is merely an attention-grabbing attempt. To this end, North Korea has now put its troops on high alert near its borders with South Korea. But even with all this being the case, there's nothing really to be worried about, despite the rhetoric from North Korea. In just a few minutes, China and Japan renew their dangerous dance. This past weekend, thousands in Seoul gathered to protest the government's ending of the Sewol sinking, despite South Korean President Park Geun-hye's tearful apology. Students, parents, foreign residents, and even small children took part in large demonstrations at their peak that may have numbered up to 30,000. The National Police dispatched 13,000 to monitor the situation. Their police buses parked along major roads as police in full riot gear stood at major plazas, intersections, and ran through the downtown area to take a position. Walking through that area gave one a sense of uneasiness, not knowing exactly what to expect. Park Sun-sik, spokesman of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, said, quote, "We are going to hold rallies every Saturday, and we'll share the plans online and through social media. We see a growing number of young kids with parents joining the rally," end quote. The weekend demonstrations was filled with protesters wearing masks and black t-shirts that carried angry words directed at the government and media. Many were holding pickets reading, "What did you do during the golden time?" and "We demand an independent probe into Sewol." Some protesters scuffled with police as they tried to march towards Cheongwon-dae, the presidential office located just a few blocks away from the plaza where the rally was centralized. According to reports, some 2,000 participated in the march to ask President Park to resign over the disaster. During the conflict, at least one protester was injured and 30 have been arrested on charges of using violence against police officers. Public uproar continues to simmer, and many have lost faith in their government. Local elections are approaching on June 4th, and the ruling Saenuri Party could see widespread losses. With the resentment directed towards President Park, a legitimate question to ask is whether or not she has enough political capital left to effectively carry out the remainder of her term. Already protests are mounting, calling for her to step down. Unfortunately, even if she were to do so, little in Korea would change. As noted in our recent Asia Now podcast dated May 17th, for the past 20 years, Korea has experienced disasters such as the Sewol. Simply changing who holds the office of the president isn't the solution. Korea must address the systemic cause. But what should President Park do? She said, quote, "The final responsibility for not being able to respond properly lies on me." Now, others have been removed from their post. If President Park remains in office, are her words just merely empty statements? Should she step down? Be sure to leave your thoughts on our comment page, Facebook wall, or through Twitter. For more stories from Asia, check out our second podcast, Asia Now. It features stories, conversations, and news taking place in Asia now. It's available through iTunes and Stitcher Radio, and of course through our website, asianewsweekly.net. This past week, I spoke with Duolingo founder Luis van An about the future of language education. Not only are the waters of the China Sea a highly contested area, but so are the skies above it. This past week, China's defense ministry said Japanese aircraft entered its air defense identification zone during a joint Chinese-Russian naval exercise. The ministry released a statement demanding cessation of all reconnaissance and interference activities, or Japan would be solely responsible for all consequences. However, with every story, there are indeed two sides to it. Japanese officials said a Chinese fighter jet flew close to a Japanese surveillance aircraft where Chinese and Japanese ADIZs overlap. Japan also says a second Chinese plane was in the same area. So just how close were these planes? According to the Yomiuri Shimbun, one Chinese fighter flew as close as 30 meters to one of the SDF planes. Citing a ministry official, quote, "It was an extremely unusual situation for military aircraft of Japan and China to come so close to a collision." End quote. This incident further underscores the dangerous nature of China's unilateral expansion into the China Sea and resistance to discuss boundary issues. The military drills with Russia in the designated waters are a no-fly and no-sail area according to advance notices placed. However, because the zones overlap, the Japanese aircraft do have a legitimate claim to fly in their own zone, which China isn't recognizing. To allow the aircraft to fly within 30 meters, as noted in this story, is simply irresponsible. We may recall that classic scene from Top Gun, where Maverick and Goose fly inverted over a MiG and give the other pilot the bird. It makes for great cinema, but getting that close when you have absolutely no idea what the other pilot will do next is just asking for trouble. Last year, when China expanded its ADIZ, it was clear an aerial showdown would take place at some point after the United States, Japan, and South Korea defied China's directive. With confrontations taking place near the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands and now in the skies above, one has to wonder how much longer the two sides can keep pushing one another without an incident that could possibly lead to fatalities. China has taken to using force against Vietnam, but understandably is more reluctant to do so against Japan. If China continues to play the brinkmanship game with Japan in the seas and skies in the disputed territories, do you think it will be an endless chess match? Or will one side inevitably have to make a more decisive move to firmly assert control? It's something Lee Hsien-loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, thinks is inevitable, stating that war may be inevitable and come in the next 20 years. Be sure to leave your thoughts on what you think will happen next on our page or tweet your responses to @AsiaNewsWeekly. To make a big bomb, or lots of small ones, you need a lot of material. Well, just how much? Try 1.8 tons. That's 3,600 pounds or 1,633 kilograms. It's also how much was confiscated in the far west province of Xinjiang, where Chinese officials are detaining 5. Local officials said 2 explosive-making sites were also destroyed in recent raids. The members of the criminal gang organized members to go to Urumqi and other areas to gather and buy raw materials for explosives and made explosive devices, and covered up a conspiracy to launch violent terrorist attacks, the Tianshan News website said. Last week, one such incident killed 43 and injured 90 in Urumqi. Before that, explosions on April 30th killed 1 and injured 79. But as deadly as these were, perhaps the most frightening was when 8 knife-wielding men attacked passengers at a train station on March 1st. They killed 29 people. Chinese media have dubbed that event China's 9/11. As a result, China has launched its year-long war on terror. In May alone, they have captured more than 200 terror and religious extremists. Those captured were in the Hotan area of southern Xinjiang and were allegedly planning additional attacks, possibly using cars to carry explosives into crowded areas. China continues to hold a Muslim minority group, the Uyghurs, responsible. Uyghurs claim religious and cultural discrimination. Unfortunately, this cache of explosive-making materials means those perpetrating the violent acts have significant resources. The plan to use explosives in public spaces seems to indicate no definite tendencies to scale back their operation. One has to wonder that if Uyghur and other extremists continue to carry out terrorist bombings and attacks, if the international community will then side with China and against their cause to develop an autonomous region. One of the goals Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had when he took office a little more than a year ago was to alter Japan's constitution to allow collective self-defense. It was a controversial move, supported by many, including the United States, but opposed by South Korea and China. Even on the home front, it's been difficult to sell, as many wonder that if deploying troops abroad would also mean incurring deaths to Japanese armed forces. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said, "It's difficult for the general public to understand, and there is strong opposition." And the numbers, they don't lie. In a Nikkei survey, 47% opposed collective self-defense, while 37% supported it. A Mainichi Shimbun survey listed 54% as opposing the idea and only 39% in favor of collective self-defense. The conservative outlet, the Sankei, announced a 70% positive opinion of collective self-defense. Now, to get those numbers, the Sankei broke out various conditions for its audience. 10.5% wanted Japan to fully use its collective self-defense rights, and 59.4% supported minimal use of the right when necessary. 28.1% said the right should not be exercised at all. The NHK also conducted a survey, with results nearly split into thirds across supportive, opposed, and don't know. To shore up support, specific scenarios were drafted where Japanese forces could be deployed abroad, and this past week, 16 separate situations were revealed to the public, where under current guidelines, Japanese forces would be prohibited from acting. Now, these include, should a foreign military power land on a remote Japanese island, if Japanese commercial vessels came under attack from foreign powers. Also, if a United States vessel were to come under attack, Japanese forces would not be able to respond. Also, if a foreign submarine was detected in its territorial waters, Japan could do nothing. It would also be prohibited from rescuing Japanese citizens if they were taken prisoner by a foreign power, or participating in international minesweeping missions or protecting commercial vessels. With regional threats from China, one can easily see why Prime Minister Shinzo Abe needs to push through the reform to ensure collective self-defense. But my question to you is this: do you feel spelling out where Japan's constitution restricts the military will be enough to sway public opinion and finally get the measure passed? Let us know in the comments or through Twitter. Those are the stories for this week, but before I go, let's take a look at some of your comments from our last episode. From Logan Mayo. One of the things that caught my attention in this episode from Asia News Weekly was the part about how League of Legends supposedly was the reason behind the murder. I agree to an extent, but mostly I say that is nonsense. I have played this game, and the people who I generally played against were verbally abusive, as many are on the internet, but death threats are commonplace. I look at it this way: in competitive games like this, the tension is generally higher than with most other games which are played for sheer enjoyment. But there has to be another variable to cause someone to take it that far. I think it was a combination of the extreme competitiveness of the game combined that led to this tragic situation. But I do not believe for a second that it had anything to do with the quote violence in this game, as it is extremely limited and very pixelated. From Antonio Velasper: frankly speaking, Thai people feel more and happy when military came out. We feel safer than country ruled by Taskin or his nominee's parliament. Grenades and gunshot which happened in the last 6 months and killed many innocent people were disappeared after the coup. As always, I do welcome your comments, so please leave them on our comment page, tweet them to me at Asia News Weekly, or leave them on our Facebook page. That is it for this week, and I would like to thank you for joining me. If you have any feedback about the podcast, please let me know. You can shoot me an email at podcast@asianewsweekly.net. You can always download the episodes through our website, but also listen to them through iTunes or Stitcher Radio. That is it for this week's episode. I'm Steve Miller, and until next time, stay true to yourself and always be awesome. Asian News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.